Evans always claimed after the disaster that he had not been offended by the sharp way he was treated by Phillips, but he didn't try and warn Titanic again of the danger his ship was in, and soon after he went to bed, having been on duty for 16 hours. The Californian was now effectively deaf, and didn't hear Titanic's calls for help, which were soon crossing the airwaves. If she had done so, she would have been close enough to steam to Titanic's help before she sank, and quite possibly have saved everyone on board. The Titanic cut through the flat ice-cold water of the Atlantic, driven on by her 3 massive propellers, leaving an ever-widening wake behind her. Dancing reflections could be seen in the dark ocean from the thousands of electric lights that shone from the long lines of windows and portholes that extended along her huge hull and upperworks. On the bridge, First Officer Murdoch stared forward into the darkness. He knew there was ice out there somewhere. Every now and then he put his glasses to his eyes. On the horizon he could see a mist that had been there for some time, but never seemed to get any closer. Sixth Officer Moody, also on watch, was being just as alert, his eyes fixed ahead, staring into the darkness. At the helm, watching the glowing binnacle, was Robert Hitchens. Suddenly, at 11:40 p.m., the calm was broken when the large 16-inch bell above the crow's nest rung 3 times. It was the signal that something was dead ahead. Then the telephone that connected the crow's nest to the bridge rang. Moody answered it, saying, "Yes, what did you see?" Murdoch turned in time to watch Moody's face change as he said, "Thank you." He then repeated Fleet's warning, "Iceberg right ahead." Murdoch didn't hesitate, shouting to the quartermaster, "Hard a starboard!" Hitchens, who was at the wheel, swung it as fast as he could until it was hard over, and the ship began to swing to port. Murdoch in the meantime ordered "Stop" on the engine room telegraph, then "Full astern." He also rang the bell that warned the crew below that the watertight doors operated from the bridge were about to be shut. Moments later he pulled the switch which automatically sealed the ship off into watertight compartments. From the time the telephone rang, agonizing seconds passed before Titanic's bow slowly started to turn to port, away from the huge iceberg that blocked her path. Up in the crow's nest, Fleet and Lee clung on as they saw the bow of the ship turn clear of the berg, which was far higher than the forecastle. They watched spellbound as the huge mountain of ice slowly passed by the starboard side of the ship, spilling tons of ice onto the deck as it went. They thought at first that they had been lucky, and that the Titanic had just missed colliding with the huge berg. Reginald Lee was to say later, the iceberg was a dark mass that came through the haze. As the boat moved away from it, there was just a fringe of white on top. That was the only white to be seen about it until we passed it. Then one side seemed to be white, and the other black. Below the waterline, where Titanic's hull came into contact with the iceberg, her plates were buckled and torn from the forepeak, along the sides of 3 cargo holds and boiler rooms 6 and 5, a distance of nearly 300 feet. Along this gash, the damage was not consistent. In some places only a narrow split was caused. In others, the hard ice penetrated deep into the ship, damaging a spiral staircase used exclusively by the crew, and a fireman's passage leading to the boiler rooms, which was 3.5 feet from the outer skin. Water immediately started to gush through these open wounds, and the decks in the first 5 of the 6 damaged compartments were awash with freezing seawater. In boiler room number 6, fireman Fred Barrett and second engineer James Hesketh had their conversation interrupted by the sound of the warning bell and the red light flashing above the watertight door. Seconds later, they heard a deep rumble coming towards them from the bow, the noise growing louder and more terrifying as the ship tore herself open against the iceberg. As the noise became almost deafening, water cascaded into their compartment under great pressure, along a line about 2 feet above the plates, which were by then vibrating violently beneath their feet. Both men dived for the watertight door as it was beginning to close, and they just made it through into number 5 when it slammed shut behind them. Other crew members in boiler room number 6 managed to escape up ladders to the next deck, leaving the water to swirl around the red-hot furnaces and pipes. In number 5, Barrett and Hesketh looked around at the surprised faces of the firemen who had stopped working at the boilers. Some were picking themselves up after being knocked off their feet by the collision. Water was coming in here too, but only at a slow rate. The berg had only damaged the plates for about 2 feet beyond the bulkhead in the coal bunker, the door of which was closed to contain it for the time being. George Cavell, who was also in number 5, cursed as he dug himself out of a bunker where he had been covered by an avalanche of coal. The question on his and everybody else's lips down in the bowels of the ship was, what had happened? The captain wanted the answer to that question too, as he rushed onto the bridge and asked Murdoch, "What was that?" "An iceberg, sir. I hard starboarded around it, but she was too close. I couldn't do any more. Close the emergency doors," Smith ordered, as he made his way to the starboard side of the bridge. "The doors are already closed, sir," replied Murdoch. Smith looked along the side of the ship to see if he could see the iceberg. As he stared into the darkness, he was joined by Murdoch and 4th Officer Joseph Boxall, who had just come onto the bridge. Boxall thought he saw a dark shadow disappear to the stern, but he wasn't sure. Captain Smith ordered Boxall to go below to determine the extent of the damage. Smith knew it would take Boxall some time to make his inspection. In the meantime, he and his officers would have an agonizing wait. A few minutes later, Ismay, who had also felt the collision, came onto the bridge to try and find out what had happened. Most of the passengers hadn't taken much notice of the slight shudder that went through the ship, or worried when the engine stopped. However, some did. First-class passengers, Mr. and Mrs. George A. Harder, a young honeymoon couple, were in bed but still awake when the ship struck. They both felt the Titanic quiver, and Harder got up and went to the porthole to look out. To his complete surprise, he saw a wall of ice passing by outside. Harder dressed at once and rushed outside to ask a steward what was happening. The steward casually told him, "Oh, it'll be a few hours, and then we'll be on our way again." James B. McGough, an American from Philadelphia, had been in bed with his porthole open as the iceberg brushed past, causing chunks of ice to fall into his cabin. He quickly got up, dressed, and went on deck, where he joined others who were also trying to find out if anything was wrong. Because of the bitter cold, most soon returned inside, where they found there was nothing to see. Titanic, although she was stopped, felt as safe and secure as ever. After all, everybody knew she was unsinkable. Major Arthur Perchon was starting to undress when he thought he felt the ship tremble, as if it had hit a large wave. He went up on deck to investigate, and joined other curious passengers staring at the tons of ice that had fallen on the well deck. No one seemed to know what had happened, and they speculated idly as they watched some men from steerage kick the ice about. The Astors, who were in bed, sat up when the Titanic hit. John J. Astor got up and went out to find a steward, while his young wife lay back again in the warmth of their comfortable bed. Astor soon returned to say that the Titanic had struck ice, but it didn't look serious. Neither he nor his wife were alarmed. They had no idea that they were spending their last moments alone together. After the few brief minutes of excitement as the ship passed the iceberg, for most of the passengers and crew on Titanic nothing seemed to have changed, and so it was to remain for the next 20 minutes or so. Except for on the lower decks, where the ship had been damaged, everywhere else on Titanic things returned to normal. For there was certainly no obvious sign of the imminent danger that threatened all on board. Some of the passengers remained in the bars, smoking and drinking. Others played cards. Those who had been woken went back to sleep. Boxall had quickly made his way down to the lowest of the steerage accommodation, pushing his way through the third-class passengers who were swarming about in the passageways and on the companionways. These poor souls had been close enough to the area of the collision to have heard the thunderous noise as Titanic made contact with the iceberg. Some had even been thrown out of their bunks. Boxall, on his examination of the ship, was unable to find any damage, and he went back up to the bridge, inspecting each deck as he went. It's hard to understand why, on this inspection, Boxall didn't go down as far as the holds, which were already rapidly filling with water. On his return to the bridge, Captain Smith was delighted to hear Boxall's good news. It was probably the last he ever heard. Smith then sent Boxall to find the ship's carpenter, who he was to ask to sound the ship. It's possible that when Boxall left the bridge for the second time, the captain ordered the ship's engines to be started again. There's no precise evidence as to when this happened, as all the officers on the bridge at the time, except for the quartermaster who was in the wheelhouse, were to go down with the ship, along with all but 2 of the crew who were in the engine room. Many of the passengers, however, remembered the engine starting again and said they felt the vibrations under their feet most reassuring. Boxall didn't have to look for Hutchinson, the ship's carpenter. He met him coming up the bridge ladder, and Hutchinson had only bad news for Captain Smith, reporting that the ship was making water fast. One can only assume it was on receiving this news that the captain ordered the engines to be stopped once more, and this time for the last time. Boxall next ran into a mail clerk, who asked him where the captain was. "He's on the bridge," Boxall replied. "Why?" "The mail hold is filling rapidly," the clerk told Boxall. "Well, you go then and report to the captain. I'll go down and see," was the young officer's reply. On reaching the mail hold, Boxall found the rest of the 5 clerks trying to drag floating mail bags up the companionway to the deck above, or removing letters that had already been sorted from the racks. As Boxall paused for a second to gaze on the scene, he realized the gravity of the situation, and once more he hastily made his way back up to the bridge. Meanwhile, Captain Smith had sent for Thomas Andrews. Smith knew that if anybody could tell him whether the ship was badly damaged or not, it was him. Smith intended that they should both do a tour of inspection of the Titanic to see what harm had been done. As Boxall returned from the mail-room with his new report, he was followed onto the bridge by Chief Officer Henry Wilde, who asked the captain if he thought the damage was serious. "Certainly," replied Smith. "I'm afraid it's more than serious." On the bridge of the stationary Californian, Third Officer Charles Groves had been watching the vessel to their southeast. He was surprised when he saw it suddenly stop and most of its lights go out. The probable explanation for this is that when Titanic turned to port to avoid the iceberg, Groves would have only had a view of her stern, giving the false impression that her lights had gone out. Captain Lord rejoined Groves on the upper bridge about 5 minutes after the unidentified vessel had stopped. He was under the impression that the ship was a freighter, possibly 5 miles away. Groves insisted that it was a liner 10 miles away. Lord told Groves to try and contact the ship with a Morse lamp to find out who she was. As Groves began to signal, the captain went below again. Groves went on signalling until he was relieved, but without receiving a reply. Back on Titanic, Smith and Andrews had returned to the bridge. On their tour of inspection, they had seen that water was already entering 6 of the watertight compartments. Andrews hastily worked out some figures and told the captain that he believed the Titanic had only an hour, or at best an hour and a half, to live. Andrews explained that this was because as more and more water flowed into these forward compartments, the head of the ship would be pulled down, and eventually the water in number 5 boiler room would tip over the top of the bulkhead into number 4, and so on, until the ship foundered. There was nothing that could be done to stop the process. It was not thought necessary when the Olympic and the Titanic were built to construct the watertight compartments amidships any higher than E-deck, only 11 feet above the waterline. If these bulkheads had been higher, it's possible that the Titanic might still have been saved. At 12:05, 25 minutes after the ship had struck, Captain Smith called his officers together on the bridge and gave them their orders. Chief Officer Wilde was to uncover the boats. First Officer Murdoch was to see that the passengers were mustered. Fourth Officer Boxall was to call Second Officer Lightoller and Third Officer Pittman. And Sixth Officer Moody was to find the list of boat assignments. Then the captain went to the Marconi office to talk to Phillips and Bride. Bride remembered, "I was just relieving Mr. Phillips, the chief operator, when Captain Smith came into the cabin and said, 'We have struck an iceberg, and I'm having an inspection made to tell what it's done to us. You had better get ready to send out a call for assistance, but don't send it until I tell you.' The captain came back 10 minutes later and said, 'Send the call for assistance.' 'What call should I send?' asked Phillips. 'The regulation international call for help, just that,' was the reply. Phillips began to send at 12:15 a.m., 35 minutes after the ship had struck. He sent CQD, joking while doing so. Titanic's call for assistance was heard by many ships. La Provence and Mount Temple were two of the first. Also, the operator at Cape Race heard Titanic giving her position as 4146 north, 5024 west. After another 5 minutes, the captain returned with a new position worked out by Boxall, which he gave to Phillips, asking him what he was sending. CQD, Phillips replied. Bride later wrote, "The humour of the situation appealed to me, and I cut in with a little remark that made us all laugh, including the captain. 'Send SOS,' I said. 'It's the new call, and it may be your last chance to send it.' Phillips, with a laugh, changed the signal to SOS. Below decks, in the 6 forward compartments, nobody was laughing, for the water was rising steadily. In the first 10 minutes, the sea was 14 feet above the keel in all but number 5 boiler room, where the pumps were containing the flow. By the time the captain had gone to the wireless office at 12:05, the water was up to G-deck, forcing seamen and steerage passengers alike to abandon their accommodation. Some of the steerage passengers were pulling their bags along Park Lane, the long passageway on E-deck, towards the stern where it was dry, while some of the off-duty firemen were carrying their mattresses away from the flooding area. Stewards for the first, second and third-class passengers began knocking on doors, telling the occupants to put on warm clothes and life jackets and make their way as quickly as they could to the boat deck. Many of the passengers were annoyed at being disturbed for what they thought was only a needless precaution. In the boiler rooms, men worked hard on the pumps, forcing out tons of water from the flooding compartments, while others were damping down the fires to try and prevent an explosion when the cold water reached the boilers. By this time, number 6 boiler room had been abandoned, as the water had become too deep to work in. In the after part of the ship, where the electrical machinery was sited, everything was still working normally, and the engineers, over 30 of them, were able to keep the lights going until just before the ship sunk, their brave devotion to duty costing all of them their lives. Second Officer Lightoller, who had been called from his cabin by Boxall, remembered, "Fourth Officer Boxall opened my door and, seeing me awake, quietly said, 'We've hit an iceberg.' I replied, 'I know you've hit something.' He then said, 'The water is up to F-deck in the mailroom.' That was quite sufficient. Not another word passed. He went out, closing the door, whilst I slipped on some clothes as quickly as possible and went on deck." Lightoller was put in charge of the lifeboats on the port side of the ship. He wrote, "The ship had been running under a big head of steam. Therefore, the instant the engines had stopped, the steam started to roar off at all 8 exhausts, kicking up a row of 1,000 railway engines thundering through a culvert. All the seamen came tumbling up on boat deck in response to the order, 'All hands on deck,' just following the instinct that told them that it was here they would be required. It was an utter impossibility to convey an order by word of mouth. Speech was useless, but a tap on the shoulder and an indication with the hand, dark though it was quite sufficient to set the men about the different jobs, clearing away the boat covers, hauling tight the falls, and coiling them down on deck, clear and ready for lowering. At 12:25 a.m., the Titanic's distress call was heard by the Cunard liner Carpathia, a 13,555-ton steamer that went into service in 1903. She had been designed for the Hungarian emigrant service, but on the 15th of April 1912, she was en route from New York to the Mediterranean. The Carpathia was 540 feet long by 64.5 feet wide, and had 1 funnel and 4 masts. She was not a luxury ship by any means, but a workhorse, with a top speed of 14.5 knots. It was only by pure chance that 21-year-old Thomas Cottam, the only wireless operator on the Carpathia, was still up, when Jack Phillips on the Titanic started to send the CQD distress call. The only reason he still had his headphones on was because he was waiting for an acknowledgement of a message he had sent to the liner Parisian. While he was waiting, he started to listen to other airwaves, and heard Cape Cod trying to send a message to the Titanic, which he wondered if she was receiving. To make sure, he decided to call up Phillips, who he had been chatting to earlier. He sent MGY, the Titanic's call sign. Then, "I say, old man, do you know there's a batch of messages coming through for you from MCC?" MCC being Cape Cod. Phillips wasted no time in cutting across Cotham's message. He sent, "Come at once. We have struck an iceberg. It's a CQD, old man. Position 4146 north, 5014 west." Cotham, not able to believe what he was hearing, sent, "Shall I tell my captain? Do you require assistance?" To this Phillips sent, "Yes, come quick." Cotham threw his earphones on the desk, and half-dressed he rushed forward to the bridge. There he found First Officer H.V. Dean on watch, the captain having already turned in. Cotham blurted out to Dean that the Titanic had hit an iceberg and was sinking, and that he was going to see the captain. The two men dashed below, and Cotham burst into the captain's cabin without knocking. The captain's indignity at Cotham's ill-mannered entrance was soon forgotten as he realized the gravity of the news he brought. Carpathia's captain, Arthur Henry Rostron, was to become the hero of the disaster. For his excellent seamanship and quick thinking in the hours that followed, was to save the lives of 703 passengers and crew from the Titanic. Rostron ordered that the Carpathia be immediately turned round as he leapt out of bed and quickly dressed. He went up to the chart room and calculated from the position he had been given that Titanic was 58 miles away to the northwest. It would take him 4 hours to reach her at Carpathia's full speed of 14 knots. As the quartermaster turned the Carpathia onto her new heading, Rostron ordered that all his department heads should join him on the bridge, where he issued the following orders. The English doctor with assistants to remain in the first-class dining room. The Italian doctor with assistants to remain in the second-class dining room. Each doctor to have supplies of restoratives, stimulants, and everything to hand for immediate needs of probable wounded or sick. Purser, with assistant purser and chief steward, to receive the passengers, etc., at different gangways, controlling our own stewards in assisting Titanic passengers to the dining rooms, etc., also to get Christian names and surnames of all survivors as soon as possible to send by wireless. He went on that all the Carpathia's passengers should be kept out of the way to prevent confusion. Coffee, tea, soup, etc. was to be put in the saloons and at the gangways. Officers' cabins, smoke rooms, library and dining rooms, etc. would be utilized to accommodate survivors. All spare berths in steerage to be utilized for the Titanic's passengers, and all Carpathia's steerage passengers were to be grouped together. The boats were to be swung out, and gangway doors were to be opened. Stewards were to be placed in passages to reassure the Carpathia's passengers if they asked questions about these operations. These orders flowed on as Rostron prepared his ship to pick up Titanic survivors. His last order was that rockets be fired at 2:45 a.m. and every quarter of an hour after to reassure Titanic. Rostron still had one major problem to face. He had to steam his ship at full speed to the spot where Titanic had struck an iceberg. He'd have to do everything possible to prevent the Carpathia suffering the same fate. He ordered that an extra man go up to the crow's nest. 2 men were sent to the bow, while others were ordered to each wing of the bridge. Rostron was a religious man. Once he had finished issuing orders, he was seen lifting his cap a few inches above his head while he said a prayer. On the Titanic, groups of first and second-class passengers were starting to gather on their respective parts of the boat deck, or in their own separate lounges where it was warmer. Here they waited with anxious faces for instructions from the crew. Most still had no idea that the ship was in any danger, and wondered why they had been told to put on life jackets and leave their comfortable cabins. The noise from the ship's exhaust made conversation impossible, and once the crew started to remove the covers from the lifeboats, making them ready to swing out, it became obvious even to the most stout-hearted that something could be seriously wrong. Still, even then, most of the passengers had faith in the ship. What could go wrong, after all, with the unsinkable Titanic? It was 12:30 a.m. when Captain Smith finally gave the order for his officers to start loading the women and children into the boats. Many of them refused to go at first, and when those who were willing found they would have to leave their husbands behind, even more reneged, saying what was the point of being dropped down to the sea in a dangerous open boat in the freezing cold, only to be picked up again a few hours later. Just a look over the rail at the dark, cold sea, 65 feet or so below, put others off, and many hung back, clinging to their husbands, when officers tried to make them disembark. It was already rumoured among the passengers that other ships were on their way to Titanic's assistance, so if the worst came to the worst, which most still doubted, everybody would be just transferred to another ship. The Titanic had 20 boats. From forward to aft, these were situated as follows. Just behind the bridge, on both port and starboard side of the boat deck, there were 2 emergency cutters. These were on davits permanently swung out and were each able to carry 40 people. Behind them came the 14 30-foot lifeboats, also on davits. 6 of these were forward, 3 on each side of the first class and officers' promenades. The other 8 were 190 feet further aft, 4 on each side of the ship on the second-class promenades. These were able to carry 65 people each. Lastly, there were the 4 Engelhardt, or collapsible boats, capable of carrying 47 people each. 2 of these were stored on the boat deck next to the emergency boats. The other 2 were on the roof of the officers' quarters. The boats on the davits were numbered from forward to aft, 1 to 16. Odd numbers were on the starboard side, even on the port. The total amount of people these 20 boats could carry was 1,178. More than required by the out-of-date Board of Trade regulations, but over 1,000 less than the total on board. The first boat to be lowered under First Officer Murdoch's instructions was number 7 on the starboard side. The time was 12:45 a.m., 1 hour and 5 minutes after the collision. This boat had a total capacity of 65 people, yet only 28 went down in her. One of the passengers, Mrs. H.W. Bishop, told the American Inquiry, "My husband was pushed in with me, and we were lowered with 28 people in the boat. We counted off as we reached the water. There were only about 12 women, and the rest were men, 3 crew and 13 male passengers. Several were unmarried men, 3 or 4 of them foreigners. On board the boat there was no compass or light." Mrs. Bishop also added, "The conduct of the crew, as far as I could see, was absolutely beyond criticism." J.R. McGough also left the ship in number 7. He said, "I had my back turned, looking in the opposite direction, and was caught by the shoulder by one of the officers who gave me a push, saying, 'Here you are, big fellow, get into that boat.' The reason so few were lowered into this boat was because very few passengers were on the boat deck at the time, and of those present, nobody else could be persuaded to get in. In the first-class lounge, there were still crowds of passengers waiting in the warm for information and instructions. Some survivors later complained that proper orders never came, and the passengers were left to rely on their own initiative. Near the grand staircase, the band started to play cheerful music to mollify the passengers. Later, they would move out onto the boat deck, where they would remain playing till the very end. A few decks below, the purser's office was beginning to be besieged by worried passengers who were starting to fear the worst and wanted their valuables from the safe, which McElroy was handing out as quickly as he could. On the bridge, the captain and 4th Officer Boxall were staring at the lights of a steamer still in the water off the port bow, some 10 miles away, they estimated. Boxall had tried to signal her with a Morse lamp, but the ship was too far away for him to be sure if she was signalling back or not. Quartermaster George T. Rowe, who was on watch on the stern bridge, was still not aware why the ship had stopped. He had seen the iceberg go past, but had no idea of the damage it had caused. He was quite surprised, therefore, when he saw a lifeboat rowing away from the ship, and he telephoned the bridge to give them the information. He was ordered to find some rockets and bring them to the bridge with him straight away. The next lifeboat to be lowered on the starboard side was number 5. 3rd Officer Pittman, who was in charge, was trying to lower the boat level with the rail of the boat deck, when along came J. Bruce Ismay in a dressing gown and carpet slippers. He was clearly in a state of excitement. Pittman didn't recognize Ismay at first, as he rushed to and fro giving orders to him and other sailors nearby. "You must load the boat quickly," Ismay shouted. "There's no time to lose." Pittman tried to quieten the man down by saying, "I wait the commander's orders." But Ismay persisted, encouraging the women close by to get into the boat. Pittman went to the captain, it having dawned on him who he might be dealing with. He told Captain Smith what Ismay was saying, and Smith said, "Go ahead, carry on." Pitman went back to the boat, and standing in it he shouted, "Come along, ladies!" By then there was a big crowd, and slowly the boat began to fill, as one after another the women and children reluctantly climbed in. Others, seeing that people were at last embarking, were also persuaded to get in by the sailors or by their husbands. One woman who was standing nearby was spotted by Ismay, who shouted, "Come along, jump in!" To which she replied, "I'm only a stewardess." "Never mind," shouted Ismay. "You're a woman. Take your place." When at last there were no more women to be seen, Pitman allowed on a few men. Murdoch, who had just seen No. 7 launched, arrived and ordered Pitman to take charge of the boat and lower away, telling him that once he was down to go to the after gangway and wait there for more passengers. Pitman shook hands with Murdoch, then jumped into the boat, in which there were still 24 empty seats. Ismay was once again on the boat deck, ordering the sailors to lower away, while he swung his arms around and around like a windmill. It was now Fifth Officer Lowe's turn to get annoyed with him, as it was he who was trying to give orders to the sailors who were working the davits. He shouted at Ismay, "If you'll get the hell out of the way, I'll be able to do something. You want me to lower away quickly? You'll have me drown the lot of them." Ismay stared at Lowe for a second, quite shocked, for an employee of White Star had never talked to him like that before, but he let it go and walked off. As No. 5 was being lowered, some men took a chance and jumped in. Mrs. C.E.H. Stengel and a small child were struck by one large man as he tumbled down on top of them. Mrs. Stengel was rendered unconscious, and 2 of her ribs were very badly dislocated. Soon No. 5 was on the flat sea, and water started to rush in where the plug had not been put in place. Quartermaster Oliver tried to reach it, but a crowd of passengers were in his way. He implored them to move, saying that the boat would soon be swamped if they didn't let him pass. Eventually he pushed his way through to the plug, and the danger was over. Pitman took command of both lifeboats No. 5 and No. 7, and they were both rowed away from the side of the Titanic. On the port side, Second Officer Lightoller had lifeboat No. 4 lowered level to the windows of A deck. He thought it would be easier for the passengers to be loaded from there, as the boat could be held more easily against the side of the Titanic without leaving a gap. The ship was starting to list to port. Unfortunately, the windows were locked, and without anybody to open them. Lightoller left No. 4 swinging where it was, and moved aft along the deck to the next lifeboat, No. 6. Here he found, as Murdoch and Pitman had on the starboard side, that the passengers were reluctant to go. One that would was Mrs. Candy, who tripped over the oars which were lying lengthwise in the bottom of the boat, and broke her ankle. Lightoller remembered about the lowering of No. 6. "I was calling for seamen, and one of the seamen jumped out of the boat and started to lower away. The boat was halfway down when a woman called out that there was only one man in it. I had only 2 seamen and couldn't part with them, and was in rather a fix to know what to do when a passenger called out, 'If you like, I'll go.' This was a first-class passenger, Major Pershon of Toronto. I said, 'Are you a seaman?' And he said, 'I'm a yachtsman.' I said, 'If you are sailor enough to get out on that fall, that's a difficult thing to get to over the ship's side, 8 feet away, and means a long swing in the dark night. If you are sailor enough to get out there, you can go down.' And he proved he was by going down. Major Pershon, before coming up on deck, had left a tin box containing $200,000 in bonds and $100,000 in stocks on a table in his cabin. He wrote of his experiences that night. "When I first came up on deck, there were about 100 stokers coming up with their dunnage bags, and they seemed to crowd this whole deck in front of the boats. One of the officers, I don't know which one, a very powerful man, came along and drove these men right off the deck like a lot of sheep. They didn't put up resistance. I admired him for it. After Pershon lowered himself into the boat, he went aft and said to the quartermaster, 'What do you want me to do?' 'Get down and put the plug in,' he answered. I made a dive for the plug. The ladies were all sitting pretty well aft, and I couldn't see at all. It was dark down there. I felt with my hands, and then said it would be better for him to do it than me to do his work. I said, "Now you get down and put the plug in, and I'll undo the shackles, that is, take the blocks off." So he dropped the blocks and got down to fix the plug, and then came back to assist me, saying, "Hurry up." He said, "This boat is going to founder." I thought he meant the lifeboat was going to founder, but he meant the large boat, and that we were to hurry up and get away from it. Boat number 6 left the side of Titanic with only 28 people aboard, 24 women and children, 2 crew and 2 men. One young Italian boy who had been ordered into the boat by Captain Smith was disabled, having fractured his arm and wrist. He later tried to row, but was unable to do so because of these injuries. It was about this time that Chief Officer Wilde, who had been working on the starboard side, came over to find Lightoller to ask him if he knew where the firearms were kept. Firearms were the responsibility of the first officer, and before Lightoller had been dropped to second, he had secured the revolvers and ammunition in an inaccessible locker in the cabin which was now Murdoch's. Here Lightoller hauled them out in front of the captain and the chief to be distributed among the officers. Lightoller was about to leave the cabin when Wilde handed him a pistol, saying, "Here you are. You may need it." On impulse, Lightoller slipped it into his pocket along with some cartridges and returned to the boats. As number 6 was lowered, the blowing off of steam was stopped after a request to the captain from Phillips in the wireless office. He had told Smith that he couldn't hear anything on his headphones. Lightoller wrote, "Just at this time, thank heaven, the frightful din of escaping steam suddenly stopped, and there was a death-like silence, 1,000 more times exaggerated fore and aft the ship. It was almost startling to hear one's own voice again after the appalling din of the last half hour or so." As he feared they might buckle if fully laden, Lightoller decided that it was safer to lower the boats only half full, and then to fill them up with passengers from the gangways on the lower decks once the boats were in the water. With this in mind, he told the boatswain's mate to take 6 hands and open the port lower deck gangway door, which was abreast of number 2 hatch. Lightoller wrote, "He took his men and proceeded to carry out the order, but neither he nor his men were ever seen again. One can only suppose that they gave their lives endeavouring to carry out this order. Probably they were trapped in the alleyway by a rush of water, for by about this time the forecastle head was within about 10 feet of the water, yet I still hoped that we should save her." While Lightoller and the other officers and crew of the Titanic worked to get the boats away, the lights of a ship could be seen on the horizon, reassuring many of the passengers, who assumed that it was on its way to the Titanic's assistance. Once Quartermaster Rowe arrived on the bridge with a box of 12 rockets, the captain pointed towards the ship off the port bow, and ordered him to fire rockets every 5 or 6 minutes to draw their attention. A few minutes later, there was a blinding flash as the first rocket shot up into the air. It soared high above the mast before it burst, and a shower of bright white lights drifted down towards the sea. On the Californian, Second Officer Herbert Stone had been keeping an eye on the unidentified ship stopped in the distance. He had tried to contact her by Morse lamp, but had received no reply as far as he could tell. He had seen flashing, but he thought it was a masthead light. Now he saw a rocket burst above her. He waited until he saw 4 more before he informed Captain Lord. "Are they company signals?" Lord asked. "I don't know," replied Stone, "but they appear to be white rockets." The master then told Stone to get the apprentice Gibson to keep on morsing the ship and keep him informed. Gibson began to signal the Titanic again, but still didn't get a reply that he could see. Instead, he and Stone watched more rockets being sent up, which they ignored. At 1 o'clock, an hour and 20 minutes after striking the iceberg, only 3 of Titanic's boats had been lowered. In these, the passengers could see to their horror how far the bow of the Titanic had settled into the water, and how many of the brightly lit portholes had disappeared under the sea. With such an immense amount of water weighing the bow of the ship down, the stern was starting to rise in the air, slowly exposing more and more of her rudder and propellers. At the bow, the forepeak was filling more slowly than the compartments further aft, but already the firemen's quarters on D-deck were awash. Below that, the seamen's quarters on E-deck were full, plus some of the more forward third-class and first-class cabins. Also on E-deck, as the ship settled, water was starting to splash along the long passageway called Park Lane or Scotland Road that ran virtually the whole length of the ship. The progress of the sea was sometimes delayed by the wooden bulkheads between the cabins or passageways, but these were not built to be watertight and were soon washed away as the pressure of water against them increased. Below E-deck, and aft as far as the bulkhead between boiler rooms 5 and 4, everything was under water. This included all the cargo holds, mailroom, post office, squash racket court, plus crew accommodation, and a large number of third-class passenger cabins and communal areas on F and G decks. Looking towards the stern, boiler room number 4, which was just forward of the second funnel, and all other 9 compartments aft were still dry. Except for the noticeable forward slant of the decks, everything still seemed normal, and the stokers remained at their stations. On the lower decks aft, hundreds of mostly third-class passengers, having been woken by the stewards, were waiting in their cabins or in the passageways, wondering what to do. At 12:30, third-class steward Hart, who had been dispatched down by an officer to help send up the women and children, found that not many wanted to go. With some difficulty, he gathered a small group together who were willing to leave, and led them towards the boat deck. Other steerage passengers, mostly men, were wandering around either alone or in small groups, trying to find their own way up to the boats. Most were carrying their bags or cases, which held all their worldly possessions. Others still believed, as did many first and second-class passengers, that the ship was unsinkable, and didn't want to make a fuss, expecting that at any minute everything would be back to normal, and the ship would be on its way again. At 1 o'clock, Hart went back down again. This time more women and children were willing to leave, as it was becoming more obvious that the ship was in trouble. Many of the men who had made their way aft along Park Lane from their flooded bow cabins wanted to go up too. Hart told them that this was out of the question. His orders were women and children first. With that he left, with what was to be his last group. Many of the men, on seeing Hart leave, took it upon themselves to find their own way up to the boats, taking with them as many women as they could persuade to go. Others, many of whom couldn't speak English and didn't understand what was happening, stayed where they were until it was too late, and they went down with the ship. In the wireless room, Philip stayed in contact with the Carpathia, where Cottam was continually keeping him up to date with their progress, details of which were immediately taken to Captain Smith. Phillips also had to answer an endless stream of questions from other ships about Titanic's condition and position. Even the Olympic, which was about 500 miles away, contacted her, a wireless operator telling Phillips, "Am lighting up all possible boilers as fast as can." The Olympic began to race towards her stricken sister, but was far too far away to reach her in time. On the bridge, Pittman and Rowe were still sending up rockets and using the Morse lamp to try to contact the ship on the horizon. Captain Smith, too, kept glancing towards the light off the port bow, but it still remained stationary, ignoring Titanic's appeals for help. On the Californian, Mr. Stone and the young apprentice Gibson were still watching Titanic's rockets. Stone looked through his glasses and said, "Look at her now. She looks very queer out of the water. Her lights look queer." As they both watched, another rocket flew into the air above the distant ship. Stone commented, "A ship is not going to fire rockets at sea for nothing." It's easy to criticize with hindsight, but it's difficult to understand why nobody on the Californian thought of waking up their wireless operator to see if he could hear any distress calls, especially as the Californian herself was stopped surrounded by ice. It would only have taken a few minutes and could have saved 1,500 lives. Captain Lord would then have been the hero of the hour, instead of being condemned for the rest of his life for ignoring Titanic's rockets. Between 1 o'clock and past, 8 more lifeboats were launched by Titanic's crew, while all the time her bow was sinking lower and lower into the freezing sea. The first of these was number 3 on the starboard side. According to the records from the British Inquiry, this boat had the largest number of crew on board, 15 in all. With them, there were 35 passengers, of whom 25 were women and children. The rest were men, 4 of whom were accompanying their wives. These figures illustrate that even with the water climbing steadily towards Titanic's forecastle, the officers still had a problem in getting the women to leave the ship. Henry Sleeper Harper and his wife even found space for their Pekingese, called Sanyet-Sen, and an Egyptian dragoman named Hanad Hassa, who they'd found in Cairo and brought with them. The next boat away on the starboard side was the emergency cutter that was permanently swung out just behind the bridge. It could carry up to 40 people, but surprisingly it was ordered away with only 12 on board. 7 of these were crew, while among the 5 passengers were Lord and Lady Cosmo Duff Gordon. Lord Duff Gordon was later accused of bribing the crew, offering them £5 each not to return to pick up survivors from the water after the Titanic had sunk. It was said that he and Lady Duff Gordon had been worried that should the boat be rowed back, amongst the hundreds of poor wretches that were fighting for their lives in the freezing water, it would be swamped. Lord Duff Gordon's answer to this allegation was that the crew in his boat had complained of losing all their kit on the Titanic, and as an act of kindness, he offered them the money to replace it. He was eventually exonerated, but he and the other 11 people in number 1 would have to remember for the rest of their lives the terrible screams of those in the water, knowing there were 28 empty places in their boat. At 1:10, as number 1 had been lowered on the starboard side, number 8 was also ready on the port side. In it was Mrs. J. Stuart White. Her friend, who had stayed on board, shouted out to her, "You can't get back on board tomorrow morning without a pass." Still, by some, the disaster was not being taken seriously. Mrs. Tausig, whose daughter was already in the boat, had to be dragged away from her husband's arms and virtually thrown in by 2 sailors. She would never see her husband again. Other women passengers were helped in by the young steel heir, Washington Roebling II. He stood back as it was lowered and leant on the rail, waving as he lit a cigarette. He, too, was to perish. Also in number 8 were some of the steerage passengers, led up by Steward Hart. He later recalled that as quickly as he was putting the women into the boat, others were jumping out again, trying to get to the warmth and apparent safety of the lounges. Captain Smith himself helped to load and lower number 8, shouting to Seaman Jones, who was in charge, "Is the plug in?" "Yes, sir," Jones replied. Smith then looked round the deck, shouting 2 or 3 times, "Are there any more ladies?" When none came forward, Smith ordered that the boat be lowered away, he himself on the forward falls. As the boat went down, Smith called out, "Row for the light," which could be seen by all in the distance. "Land the people there, and then come back to the ship." One old lady who refused to get into the boat was Mrs. Strauss. She had clung to her husband with great strength as the sailors tried to force her away, saying, "We have lived together for 40 years, and we will not part now." She could not be persuaded, and they both perished. First-class passenger Mrs. J. Stuart White, whose friend had called to her as she sat in the boat, was not satisfied at all with the conduct of the crew. She said at the American Inquiry, "Before we cut loose from the ship, these stewards took out cigarettes and lighted them, on an occasion like that." She went on, "All of these men escaped under the pretense of being oarsmen. The man who rowed near me took his oar and rowed all over the boat in every direction. I said to him, 'Why don't you put the oar in the oarlock?' He said, 'Do you put it in that hole?' 'Certainly,' I said." Most of the men Mrs. White spoke to admitted they had not rowed before. She was disgusted and said, "These were the men we were put to sea with that night, with all those magnificent fellows left on board who would have been such a protection to us." Mrs. White remembered about the lights, too. "The officer who put us in the boat gave strict orders to make for the light opposite, land passengers, and then get back just as soon as possible. That was the light everybody saw in the distance. It was 10 miles away, but we rowed and rowed and rowed, and then we all decided that it was impossible for us to get to it." Having failed to reach the light, the boat turned back towards the Titanic. It seemed by then that the disgruntled women had taken over. "The women in our boat all rowed, every one of them. Miss Young rowed every minute. The stewards didn't know the first thing about it and could not row. Countess Rothes stood at the tiller. Where would we have been if it had not been for the women, with such men as were put in charge of the boat? Our head seaman was giving orders, and these men knew nothing about the boat. He said, 'If you don't stop talking through that hole in your face, there will be one less in the boat.' We were in the hands of men of that kind." Another 10 minutes passed before the next 2 boats were ready to be lowered. The first of these was number 9 on the starboard side. By this time, Titanic's bow was nearly under the water, and more passengers from all classes were making their way onto the boat deck. Consequently, the crew were having far less difficulty in filling the seats. Stuart W. Ward, who was in number 9, said at the America inquiry that he had assisted in taking the canvas cover off and helped level the boat to the boat deck. It is possible that this boat might also have taken on passengers from A deck as well. There's a contradictory evidence on this point. Ward went on, "Officer Murdoch, Purser McElroy, and Mr. Ismay were near this boat when being loaded. A sailor came along with a bag and threw it in. He said he'd been ordered to take charge of it by the captain. The boatswain's mate was there and ordered him out." One of the officers by the boat shouted, "Pass the women and children that are here into the boat." There were several men standing around, and they fell back. There were quite a lot of women nearby, and one by one, many of them were helped on board. One old lady made a great deal of fuss, refusing to get in, while a French woman fell and hurt herself in her hurry to leave. Quartermaster W. Wynne, who was also in Boat 9, saw a ship's lights nearby, possibly 2. He told the British inquiry that he saw the lights of a steamer, a red light first, and then a white one, about 7 or 8 miles away. After an interval, both lights disappeared. 10 or 15 minutes afterwards, he saw a white light again in the same direction. These lights, if he did see them, could not have been from the Californian, as number 9 was lowered on the starboard side of the Titanic, and Californian was lying off the port bow. Many of the passengers and crew reported that they had seen the lights of a ship or ships that night. Some might have seen the Californian off the port bow, yet there is strong evidence pointing to other ships being close by when the Titanic sunk. It could have been the Norwegian vessel, the Samson, mentioned in the British inquiry, where it was suggested that she didn't stop because she was illegally hunting seals. Fourth Officer Boxall claimed that he saw a 4-masted steamer 4 or 5 miles away. He said it seemed to be approaching Titanic, then turned and headed away. Lightoller also thought he saw a ship's light as he was loading the lifeboats. Another candidate for the mystery ship that night was the Mount Temple, who on hearing Titanic's distress call immediately changed course and steamed for her position. On her dash towards the sinking ship, her captain, James Henry Moore, claimed he saw 2 other ships, one a 4-masted schooner, which he had to throw his engines into reverse and turn sharply to avoid. Shortly after this, the schooner turned out her lights and disappeared. The second ship he encountered was off the Mount Temple's port bow. Moore described it as a foreign tramp steamer of 4,000 to 5,000 tons, without ensign. She had a black funnel with a white band near the top, containing some kind of device. This ship could have been the Saturnia, which had also changed course to aid the Titanic, and was eventually forced to stop because of the ice. Moore, too, had eventually to stop because of the ice. He said afterwards that he had never seen so much ice so far south. He also added that he certainly would not have followed Captain Smith's example and maintained a high speed after such ice warnings. The description of the Mount Temple, however, fitted Boxall's account of the ship he saw. There could have been other ships nearby too, without wireless or with their operator asleep. It's doubtful now that the question of the mysterious lights, if they existed, will ever be solved, and Captain Lord of the Californian will remain the scapegoat of the tragedy. It is also possible that many of the passengers, even the crew, might have mistaken stars for ship's lights. An example of this took place on the bridge of the Titanic. Captain Smith was standing next to Quartermaster Rowe, who was still signalling with the Morse lamp in between sending up rockets. Rowe told the captain that there was another light off the starboard quarter. Smith looked towards it with his binoculars, then handed them to the quartermaster to take a look for himself, saying, "I'm afraid it's only a planet." But he complimented Rowe on his eagerness. On the Californian, Captain Lord remained asleep, while those on the bridge did nothing more than watch as more and more rockets were fired in the distance. It appeared to them, as Titanic sunk lower and lower into the water, her lights disappearing deck by deck, that she was steaming away from them. At 1:20, as lifeboat number 9 was lowered on the starboard side, simultaneously number 10 was going down on the port side. Both were just about full. The crew had had a great deal of difficulty in loading number 10, as Titanic had a list to port, and the boat swung further and further away from the side. This increased the women's anxiety, and the crew ended up literally throwing them in. Seaman Evans told the American Inquiry, "A young ship's baker was getting the children and chucking them into the boat." Mr. Murdoch, he said, was making the women jump across a 2.5-foot gap to get into the boat. If they wouldn't jump, they were thrown in. One woman in a black dress slipped and fell. She seemed nervous and didn't want to jump at first. When she did, she fell between the ship and the boat. She was pulled in by some men on the deck below, went up on the boat deck again, took another jump, and landed safely in the boat.